friends, those of us who've been involved in the anti-war campaign for many years are now living in a strange world. And it's not just that the world is strange, it's that there is growing disputes between activists. The left has been very divided on some of the wars, Libya and Syria in particular. And so it seems that the unity that was built up to try and stop the Iraq war has fractured a bit, and that's what I want to discuss. Why has this happened? If you take the arguments which are being used by those who either publicly or secretly want the West or wanted the West to intervene in Syria, all those arguments could have been used about Iraq. Saddam was a brutal dictator, he killed people, we knew all that. The only thing they lacked, the West, at the time when they went to war in Iraq, was images, because he hadn't done anything for a long, long time. And the last time there had been repression in Iraq was on the heels of the first Gulf War, and prior to that the Iran-Iraq war, in which the West was supporting. So using images from the first was difficult, and using images from the second, in which Western armies went and decimated the Iraqi army, the Turkish Shoot, as it was known. But I start with Iraq because what subsequently was planned for Syria and Iran was not so different. Some of you will remember, those with longer memories than others, that the first statement made by the Israeli ambassador the day Baghdad fell, public statement in Washington, D.C., published in the New York Times, congratulating the United States and saying, we have taken Baghdad, now let's go and finish the job forward to Damascus and Tehran. So they saw it very clearly as part of a pattern that any independent regime, and they were not interested in democracy or human rights or any of that, any independent regime that existed in the region, the time had come to get rid of them, one way or the other. And so the plan was set into motion from that time onwards. Then the Arab Spring erupted. And at first the West was taken by surprise, certainly in Tunisia, and also in Egypt. They tried to patch things up, they failed, they lost one dictator, then they lost another dictator, and then they thought it was a good mechanism by which they could intervene, pretending that they were for the Arab Spring. In Egypt, as we know, they tried to link up with the Brotherhood, which failed for them, and they've now got a military dictatorship with which they're trying to settle and do a deal. And when the uprising erupted in Syria, naturally, virtually all of us present here, I'm sure, supported it. None of us had any illusions about the regime. It was obvious that what had taken place in Syria was part and parcel of the Arab movement for emancipation, for liberation, etc., that was sweeping the Arab world. And I wrote at the time that ideally that was a critical moment for the Ba'athist regime in Syria. Had they done a deal with the opposition within the first 6 months, agreed to a constitution, the situation would have been very different. They made mistakes, serious, critical mistakes, which created the basis then for the movement, the bulk of which had been peaceful, not in favor of taking out weapons. The basis was created for intervention. And the intervention didn't come directly from the West in this case. It came from various substitutes in the region, from Turkey, the eastern flank of NATO. Sometimes when people think about Turkey, they do not know or they do not remember, because the press doesn't play it up, that Turkey has been a central element of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization since that body was set up. So when the Turks decide to go into action, they are not doing it of their own accord. They are doing it because that is the decision made by NATO. And the notion that Saudi Arabia and Qatar are somehow independent states in that region is, of course, foolish. No one seriously believes that. They have different interests, but they are not independent states. Sometimes they argue amongst each other, but ultimately, when push comes to shove, they're responsible and they answer to Washington. So we saw a three-pronged intervention in Syria by the Turks, NATO, by the Saudis trying to shore up their own support and Salafi influence, and by the Qataris trying to revive what was left from the old repression of the Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood. Within all this, there were independent-minded layers, as there were in Tunisia, as there were in Cairo. And soon a big atmosphere was built up, the usual one, intervention. I was shocked, I have to tell you, watching an old comrade on video. One of the dissident communists of the Syrian, expelled from the Communist Party for supposedly for Trotsky's sympathies, etc., kept in prison by the Baathists for 20 years. And this, one can't blame him in a way, but I'm just trying to explain the mood. This excellent comrade, I heard him, I had met him soon after his release. I heard him saying, pleading with the interviewer, saying, when is the international community going to intervene? And when I hear that sentence, no matter who raises it, when I hear that sentence, you just know, one knows that effectively the left is not capable of taking on the regime. It is totally dependent now on a Western intervention, like the Iraqi communists were in Iraq, by the way. And this is a huge, huge problem. What do? We certainly will not support an intervention. Why? For reasons of principle? Yes, certainly. We don't know of any wars in which the United States has gone in and the result has been better. And one reason there was hostility even to a Syrian intervention from elements within the Pentagon and within some of the establishments elsewhere is because of what had happened in Libya not so long ago. That this war, starting off by a so-called no-fly zone to supposedly protect the citizens of the country, backed, unfortunately, by many people on the left who should have known better. And what did they do? They used the no-fly zone. And then for 6 months, NATO planes bombed Libya. A 6-month bombing of Libya. How many people died? We still don't have the figures. The figures have not been given to us. I asked a SOAS professor who had been working with the Foreign Office and was arguing with me. I said, how many people do you guys think you killed? Because I said, a drone attack in one day can kill 40 to 50 people quite easily. A 6-month bombing by NATO in Libya, how many people died? Because you supposedly went in to stop a massacre in Benghazi, so just give us a figure. How many people was it necessary to kill to stop what you thought might be a massacre? He said, I don't know, Tarek. I said, you don't know? You're in and out of the Foreign Office and you don't know? He said, why don't you take a guess? I said 30,000? That would be my guess, seeing what NATO is capable of doing. He said closer to 20, I think. I said, oh, well, that's fine. That's fine. So it was that the West knew they'd bungled badly, and they had created a nightmare in Libya which carries on to this day, so much so that the US are training a special ops division to go in again. That is happening even as we meet here. So after that, there was a great, and you know, after the Benghazi, the city they went to save, was the city where there were jihadis, quite strong and armed, who knocked off the American ambassador, tried to knock off the Italian and British ambassadors, and came close to doing so. So even the most hardcore supporters of what happened in Libya felt slightly embarrassed, saying, you know, what have we created? And the notion that that was going to be created in Syria, were they to intervene, the Pentagon, from what we know, said no soldiers on the ground. Bombers you can have, but without putting soldiers on the ground, we can't do anything. So they could have knocked out the Syrian Air Force, and then contradictions between old friends came to the fore, and the Russians and the Chinese stepped in and said, no, we voted for Libya, and you totally betrayed us by taking the country, taking its oil, and making war. So we're not going to vote for you. We're going to veto any attempt to take over Syria. Don't underestimate the importance of that. It's not that Putin is good or the Chinese are great. It's just that they defend their own interests. And their own interests were not going to be defended or safeguarded by any takeover of Syria, or Iraq, even more seriously, for that matter. So they oppose it. And one can't say your bad guys don't oppose it. I mean, what is all this nonsense? They oppose it for their reasons, and that opposition to it creates a new space for the anti-war. Because it then becomes a real issue discussed on a global scale, and they can't ignore serious discussion on the media. So there was no intervention in Syria, and as the comrade here said, the British House of Commons, I think for the first time ever, voted against a war. And the reason they voted against a war is A, they knew it was unpopular, and also the fact that they got away with the vote was that a lot of conservative members of Parliament actually took the initiative and said no. Whether they had been given a nod and wink by the American embassy, who knows, it'll come out. But we know that there was unease even in the United States about going to this route. So what do we say? What is our position? The last text I wrote on Syria in The Guardian, I said, this was 2.5, 3 years ago, I said, because there's nothing more left to say, that what we're going to see is ugly, unpleasant, stalemated civil war. And the only hope is some peace settlement between the sane elements of the opposition and the regime, which should be pushed through. And to be fair on this, it has to be said that the big opposition to doing a deal with the regime has not come from Assad. Whether we like him or not, it has not come from him. It has come from the opposition. And the opposition is all over the place. So for me I've been attacked a lot for my position on Syria, for refusing to say what is going on is a revolution, and that those who oppose this revolution are counter-revolutionaries or variants of this argument. It's complete and utter nonsense. And we've already seen in Egypt what's happened. That half the people who were supposedly making the revolution ended up backing the military, and we now have a military dictatorship under which, I was in Cairo 2 weeks ago, under which conditions are already tougher than they were in the last years of Mubarak. I have no doubt about that at all. So I'm just fed up with hearing all these arguments that you come out and demonstrate on the streets. There are no real politics, there are no political formations. The only political formations are formations of the religious right or semi-right. They win because there's nothing else, and then we sit and moan. We have to know that the reason this happens is we don't have political movements and political parties of a new type linked to these movements. like we have in Greece. We have Syriza in Greece. Or we have in parts of South America. We have not seen the development of these in the Middle East. They are good people, small groups of people, not unlike ourselves, who do the best they can. But to jump from the fact that they are good people to the fact that they are in command of a large section of the masses is pure dreaming. That wasn't true in Egypt, and it's not true in Syria. So in this awful civil war, what can we do? It's difficult to support either side, but we have to say we are totally opposed to imperial interventions in Syria, which would make things worse, not better. That is the lesson we've learned. We've got to stand firm by this, because this business is going to go on. You know, you saw how easy it is, and many of us who've been in the latest phase of wars remember how easy it was to whip up public opinion on Kosovo. Genocide, genocide, genocide. The final figures supplied by the UN investigators were that under 3,000 people died. Now that's awful, but it's not genocide, excuse me. And the ease with which public opinion is whipped up is very frightening. And you saw it beginning to happen in the case of the Ukraine as well. As if NATO hasn't been intervening, as if we know it because it's public, the Americans and the Europeans discussing how to get rid of an elected leader. Crook he may be, but so are most of the crooks in Western Europe. They're elected as well. That you get rid of him, and then they're discussing on who to replace him with. Someone the Americans trust or someone the Europeans trust. And this is somehow supposed to be democracy. And the guy finally elected is a billionaire oligarch who has looted that country. And we're told this is all fine because this is democracy and Putin is evil. He was not evil when he did something really horrible, which was crush the Chechen uprising, destroy Grozny, backed by Bush, backed by Blair, backed by the media. That was all fine because he was our friend then. And this is the way they operate, and this is the way arguments are carried out. And we just have to be aware of that. There's nothing easy now in this world, but what is crucial, I mean, I really look back just historically to a period prior to 1917 and even prior to the early years of the 20th century, when American liberals and radicals, fearing the might of their own nation, set up the anti-imperialist league. There was no threat from anyone then to the United States, but the United States was a threat to the rest of the world, and the occupation of the Philippines led Mark Twain, Henry James, William James, a whole group of intellectuals and others, and they had finally set up the Anti-Imperialist League in the United States in 40 different cities, with large branches in Chicago and New York in the West, because they felt something had to be done. And so I feel in a way we're in that period. You know, it's not a question of saying is country X ruled by a good ruler or a bad ruler. It's a question of seeing very clearly what the American empire is up to and why it needs to be stopped. Ultimately, its own people who could stop that. But Chalmers Johnson, a former CIA analyst, very brilliant academic, a specialist in China and Japan, the last book he wrote, Nemesis, said that unless this empire closes down its bases and comes back home, we're going to have a military coup, ultimately, and democracy will disappear. Now, this may be exaggerated, but if you look at what is happening to democracy all over the Western world, it is heavily under attack by capital and empire. These are the two things that are attacking it. Neoliberal capitalism, i.e. capitalism, can't tolerate too much dissent. And the empire and its wars can't tolerate too much dissent. I noticed and a sort of fear, a chill went through me, that when those two Chechen kids did the crazy thing in Boston, the ease with which the entire city was closed down, and the thought went through my head, dress rehearsal. But they didn't need to do that, for God's sake. Just two kids. And when they found them, they shot them dead, or tried to kill one and kill the other. So there's no trial anyway. But the operation was successful. The entire population collaborated. And that is how democracy will be brought down, is when people become fearful and feel that what their governments are doing is it's necessary to do, and fear that if they open their mouths and dissent, they could be locked up, they could be challenged. We haven't reached that situation yet. I don't want to exaggerate, obviously, but we are moving in that direction in many different countries. I mean, the way in which demonstrations in this country are being treated by students or people working on campuses and others, the gut response when the tube workers, railway drivers came out on strike, banned them. That is what the Mayor of London said. Perhaps these people should not be allowed to strike because this is an essential service. So all this is going on. And so those of us who've been very active in Stop the War Committee, and you know, one of the great things is that many of you here have kept this committee going, which is a huge thing. It doesn't matter whether the size of the demonstration is big or small. What is important is to keep this going so that arguments can be heard, so authorities can be challenged. And it would be a sad day if some of us now, getting old, all we did was stop and watch television and cry at the horrors of this world, or what is happening. You know, people are dying in Syria. Yes, we know people are dying in Syria, and we try and do something about it. This atomization of people, that they see these images, and I know many on the left all over Europe who've done, but did you see this? I said, yeah, did you see this? Did you? I said, they didn't show it on television when they massacred 1.5 million communists in Indonesia. But what if they had showed it? What would our argument have been? That China should intervene? I said, why would nobody have argued that? Or that Soviet bombers should come and bomb Jakarta? We would not argue like that because we don't think like that. We know sometimes defeats happen, and they're depressing and they're miserable. And we carry on. Ultimately, the masses will emancipate. So that's all. How do we quantify genocide? Very difficult to answer that, to be honest. Normally, we use genocide for events where whole ethnic groups are wiped out. The obvious one, of course, is the Judeocide of the Second World War, where the Third Reich and its allies virtually succeeded in wiping out the Jews of Europe. Not mentioned of the 20th century is what Belgium did in the Congo, where the figures were even larger. Adam Hochschild, who's a great expert on Congolese history, says that according to his research, between 8 and 10 million Congolese died under Belgium and Belgian rule. Certainly, one would classify that as a genocide. And by the way, given that we're also going through some of these bad debates on the First World War, whenever anyone says to you, plucky little Belgium, do remember the Congo. Because the people of the Congo did not recognize Belgium as a plucky little colonial country, but regarded it as a squalid bunch of killers. And the country was actually technically owned by the king till later. It was owned by Leopold. It was his fiefdom when all these things happened. So all this stuff is forgotten. But to come back to your question, and the most recent genocide I suppose we have seen is in Rwanda. I think if you call everything genocide, the word loses its meaning. One of the Israeli radical historians has called what has been done to the Palestinians as politicide. Interesting, saying an attempt to wipe out a people politically, deny them all representation, etc. But I'm nervous about constant use of the word genocide, because nowadays it's associated with the arguments used before you go to war. And it's wrong. It doesn't fulfill any function except the function of going to war. I would be careful when this word in particular, which is invested with huge meaning, is used. To answer the question about Saudi Arabia, this is related to a larger question, which is that, it's a cliche almost to say that the way empires rule, and certainly the British Empire did it like that, is divide and rule. I mean, if you look at all the countries, or most of the countries where the British Empire was, when they left, those countries were divided, whether it was India, whether it was Cyprus, whether it was Central Africa, whether it was Ireland, you name it, and by and large those countries were divided. And the United States, of course, hasn't worked as an empire like the British did by going and occupying, staying 50 years, 60 years, 150 years. They usually work as an empire through putting in place local collaborators who do the business for them and who can be defended when they have to be defended. In the case of Iraq, where they did decide to occupy, it's now very obvious that the decision that they took was to completely destroy every remnant of the former regime. Something they had not done in Japan, where they had kept the emperor who ordered the Second World War and Pearl Harbor and all that. They didn't do it in Italy, where 60% of Mussolini's apparatus which ran the state was kept on. 60% police, judiciary, military officers. And in Germany, the figure is 50% plus. So in these three countries, which according to all accounts were horrific in what they did in the Second World War, the United States and its allies did not feel it necessary to totally destroy the state structures because they feared revolution, to be perfectly frank. They feared if they did that, they might not be able to control mass uprisings from below, which with strong communist parties might have taken part, including in Japan, where the Communist Party was very strong at the time. So it was the Cold War anti-communism which stopped them going that route. Well, in Iraq that wasn't the case. The Communist Party, what was left of it, was supporting the United States and came out publicly the day after Baghdad fell, demonstrating its joy. So there's no threat from the left at all. The threat they felt was that, and this is an irrationality on their part, which is that the close links they have with the Israeli state means that the destruction of the Iraqi army was a promise that had been made. The Iraqi army was feared by the Israelis. It was the only strong force in the region which they felt during the first Gulf War could go for them. And this entire army had to be destroyed. And in order to destroy that army, they needed allies. And so the beginnings, if you like, of the Sunni-Shia divide in the Arab world they were there in a limited way, but they begin in a systematic, organized way with the war in Iraq. Because you link up with the clerical parties, the Shia clerical parties, you allow them to build their army. There's ethnic cleansing in working class districts in Baghdad, which were mixed districts, Sunni, Shia, Kurds, mixed marriages, people lived together, wipe out. Units set up by the American army went and actually helped do all this. Some of this hasn't come out. And so the Iraq business was decisive. Then, having done that, they realized one day when they woke up is that without meaning to, they had made Iran the strongest country in the region. This was a big problem for them. Why? Because Iran was not like Iraq. However the clerics ruled, you know, you had elections, you had a thriving culture, there was even dissenting voices. If you look at what was published in the Iranian press, some of it was quite critical, by the way, even at the peak of clerical rule. So it was not exactly like a Ba'athist regime. And there's no doubt if they'd gone for Iraq, there would have been a mass uprising against any entry of American troops. So the Israelis were nervous about Iran because the Iranians could produce nuclear weapons. And why not, I ask? Of course, we're all opposed to nuclear weapons. If Pakistan has them, India has them, Israel has them, China has them, these are all countries in the region. I mean, why blame the Iranians for thinking that the only way they can protect themselves is by actually having nuclear weapons? It's a protection. They didn't go down that route, but they may well go down that route one of these days. So the pressure on Iran came from the Israelis, but there was also within the State Department and Pentagon factions who said this is irrational. We can't allow the Israelis to totally have it all their own way, especially as they give us nothing back in return. And so there was at one point a strong desire to stop, to have some deal. I mean, there was at one point even talk maybe Obama should fly to Tehran and do the deal with them. This was discussed, but they finally, I mean, there's too much pressure from the other side, and they didn't do it. But to answer your question, Chris, it is heavy Israeli pressure in that region. Until there's an American government that breaks with the pressure, all this stuff is going to go on in one way or the other. It will go up or down. It's not going to disappear. To the first question about international brigades. These are very different times. You know, I remember when I was in North Vietnam in 66, 67, when the country was being bombed to smithereens by the Americans. We could only travel during the night because it was impossible to move during the day. They bombed anything that moved. And naturally, those of us there for the Bertrand Russell War Crimes Tribunal were very upset and moved and angry. And at one point when we had a meeting with Pham Van Dong, the Prime Minister of North Vietnam, I raised the question. I said, comrades, would you like international brigades? Because given what the mood in Europe is on this war, there's no doubt we could bring people and fight. And he gave me a hug and shook hands, and he said, you know something, let me be very blunt with you. This is not Spain. This is one of the most obscene wars you have seen. And to get people from Europe, though from the point of view of propaganda it would be very important, it would cost us so much time looking after you people that we might actually not be doing our duty in defeating the Americans. And he was absolutely right. And he said, your task is to go and build an anti-war movement in your own countries. That is the best help you can give us. And then at one point when Ho Chi Minh met the very big leadership delegation from the Italian Communist Party, you know, this wasn't people like us, you know, belonging to small groups. This was a large mass working class party. I can't remember whether Berlinguer went or not, but you know, one of the last big Italian leaders of the workers' movement. And they met with Ho Chi Minh, they asked for a meeting, and they said, comrade, what can we do to help you? And they were stunned. He said, it would be helpful if you made the revolution in Italy. He actually said that, and they came back stunned, saying, you know, Ho's become a trot, what's going on? But it was logically, It was a perfect reply, saying you have the power. Okay, not a revolution, but call an indefinite general strike, drive the Americans out of England. That's what he was saying. That we can't do now. I mean, we can do what we do, and we can build class actions where possible, but we can't do it. In my opinion, the most important thing to do is to help in any way we can to build an anti-war or anti-imperialist movement in the United States of America. They're hard to have. And they've fallen out, they've not succeeded in doing it. But that country remains vital, quite honestly. If anything is going to happen, you know, in a progressive direction as far as the American empire is concerned, it has to happen there. Of course, it will be helped and will be helped by outside events, but that's where it's going to happen. The question asked, where do we go from here? We stay here. We don't have to run away anywhere, you know, because what is going on in the world, you know, recently the figure we have is there's a presence of the American military in 45 African countries. 45 African countries. Why? Well, what are they threatening? They destroy Libya. Part of the Africans who Gaddafi helped go back to Mali. I mean, the whole thing is a mess. Then there's the French send troops into Mali. AFRICOM, the big American operation designed for Africa, is now also preparing to send troops and special operations units into 4 different countries. It's a never-ending business. And we will see what the situation, or some of you will see, the younger ones, what the situation is like in 50 years' time. But it is not looking good. The United States are determined to defend and protect their hegemony. And they will, if the Chinese actually challenge them globally, they will react. Have no doubt about it, they will react. At the moment, Russia and China are just playing in their own areas, saying this is our little zone of influence. They haven't done anything globally as such, apart from not letting them go to war, which is not unimportant. But it's a foolish notion to think that the American empire is on the decline, or, you know, they've suffered setbacks. The biggest setback they suffered was in Vietnam, where they were defeated politically, ideologically, militarily. 3 defeats in 1. And still they came back. I remember all the arguments at the time. They're finished, that's it, they're never going to invade another country again. It didn't quite happen like that. And we know the reasons why. So they will defend their hegemony. And often it really makes me very sad when intelligent people who should know better discuss the Middle East, a region of vital strategic influence for the energy, in particular to the United States, talk about things happening in the United States without mentioning American policy, as if it's all independent of what's going on, and they don't like thinking about it. And this, by the way, was a big weakness in Egypt, I thought, and said so at the time, at the height of the uprisings. Very few slogans saying that this is the regime, the Mubarak regime, which the United States has supported for the last 30 years, and Sadat before it. Just the subject didn't come up. So it's, you know, one really shouldn't forget that. On Egypt, yeah, you know, obviously these young comrades of the Revolutionary Socialist Group are good comrades, and one defends them, there's no problem about that. But from that you can't jump to a position of saying that they're in a position at the moment to do too much, because they're not a huge organization. Obviously I'm in favor of defending them against repression, as I am in favor of defending the Muslim Brotherhood against repression. I mean, you have a situation where the judiciary in Egypt, scumbags of the worst sort, who Morsi should have disbanded the minute he was president, disbanded the security and he might have been more popular. Instead he tried to do deals with them. I mean, 2 different groups of judges sentenced 1,100 Brotherhood people to death. after 10-minute trials. Unacceptable. So I defend them too. I don't agree with them, but I defend them. As for the Egyptian workers' movement, actually, to be fair, has for the last 20 years been a player. They have not managed to create a political formation, unfortunately. But they are very militant, they are very active, and I think it's not impossible that Sisi will move to ban strikes and get the official unions to police them, which they've been trying to do. So they will do that, and we obviously should mount a defense of them together with European trade unions and others. That's absolutely necessary to do that. And also, one shouldn't forget, I'm normally not someone who's over-optimistic, but one shouldn't forget that a mass which has participated in toppling a dictator has learned one thing, regardless of what other forms of politics it has or hasn't learned. It is that it has the strength to do it again. Not easy after defeats, but they know that they can do it again. And the fact that the turnout in the Egyptian election was low, and the fact that they had to extend the election for a day to make sure that every paid bureaucrat and soldier came and voted, is an interesting sign. It's a sign that even Sisi's sudden popularity, because of Morsi, is now going right down. And they will be nervous. So I am modestly optimistic about Egypt that this can't last too long. Why? Not for any reasons of sentimentality, but because they are not going to change the economic policies at all. If you hear Sisi's statements, they're just a joke. Asked about youth unemployment and what to do, there's 6.5 million kids out of work. He says, I've had an idea that, we should grow vegetables and these kids should be hired as truck drivers to go and pick up those vegetables and bring them back to the cities. This is the current leader of Egypt. And basically they're not going to do anything. You're going to have a clientelist regime with lots of businessmen doing what they were doing. And nothing much is going to change. So if that is going to carry on, then I think there will be trouble. As for the first question, which talked about legal constraints, I think that's very important. And I think here we have to answer all these supposedly normative new laws that have been put in, because like everything else done in the West, they're completely one-sided. They apply to one country and not to another. And that is how the West has operated, which is why the Chechnya question comes up again and again. And this is how they will operate. And I think we have to try, it's a long one, this, but in terms of trying to get these laws off the statute book, we need a team of lawyers. It'd be good to organize lawyers who discuss international law seriously and come up with alternatives. It would be politically correct and educationally very important how some of these things have been put. I mean, a classic case is the International Criminal Court. I mean, I don't know how many of you know that Bush, the guy whose name I forget, who Bush appointed the Tsar on Terror, whose task was to root out terrorism in the United States, interviewed by Amy Goodman last week on Democracy Now!, and Amy pushed him. She said, well, all these things you're saying, of course we agree with some of them, but if one were to take you seriously, according to what you're saying, shouldn't Bush be tried as a war criminal? And the guy said, well, if you put it like that, I can't deny it. This is the guy appointed by the Bush. Of course, it will never happen. It will never happen. And it's not a joke that the Chilcot inquiry has been delayed for so long. Because if they publish every single thing that's been reported to them, it becomes, of course they'll do it, it becomes very difficult for them not to try Blair and members of his cabinet, Jack Straw and others, for war crimes. That's what they committed, which other leaders can be known for. And then, they lost between 500,000 and 1 million Iraqis have died as a result of this. So it's not just a tiny thing that has happened. But of course it doesn't happen like that, and we have to keep pointing this out, that there are no such thing as norms unless they're used against states that are regarded as enemy states. On question from the guy from Workers' Path, look, I don't agree. I don't think the Free Syrian Army is an independent force. I think when it first started off, there were independents in it. I think it was largely run by the Turks and by NATO. And you're right, the jihadis of various sorts have been fighting it, and they've been fighting back in turn. But that basically explains the mess that would happen in Syria were these people ever to come to power. I mean, that's what I feel, and not that I support Assad, but I can't totally say that it would be a progressive move if all the people fighting Assad came to power. I think there would be huge massacres, especially of national, ethnic, religious minorities. Yes, you'll say they have been in the past, as there were in Iraq. But I'm not in favor of supporting these organizations. I think they've forfeited our right to any support, and we're just creating illusions, and these illusions will be betrayed very, very rapidly. And one reason that the Turks have had to pull back from backing, not from backing the Free Syrian Army, but from taking their advanced positions, which they had on it 2 years ago, is the West has decided not to intervene. Had the West decided to go in, they probably would have used this force. Also, I would point out, I know there's a huge debate about it, but Seymour Hersh's articles, 2 sets of articles in the London Review of Books, have not, to my mind, been properly replied to. If he claims, and normally this is a guy who reported the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, this is a guy who reported Abu Ghraib and the tortures taking place, and everyone said they were lies. And in all other cases, and the reason he knows some of these things, and he doesn't make a secret of it, is because he has very close links with elements inside American intelligence who give him this information because they are nervous about what's happening in their own country. And he publishes it. And I think the first article in particular was very convincing, that the attacks of chemical attacks were carried out by the opposition and not by us. Just think about it, okay? Obama says there's a red line, and the red line is the use of chemical weapons. The whole world knows that Syria has chemical weapons, that there are chemical weapons, and if that line is crossed, then that is, implying intervention. Now, even the craziest person in the world running a country, why the hell should they cross that red line if they know it's going to bring the wrath of a marathon? Why? But it is in the interest of those who want to provoke an intervention to carry out an act like that. And according to Cy Hirsch, Porton Down, where they know 1 or 2 things about manufacturing chemical weapons, and where they experimented on British soldiers in the 50s. They said that the gas used in these attacks was not the gas that Assad has, because they know what that gas is. So, morally, where do people stand there? Their gas is better than ours. So I don't go along with that, and I agree very strongly with Lindsay. The central enemy for people living in the West is an old socialist tradition that the enemy is at home, which we shouldn't forget, that the enemy is somewhere else and what we're doing is fine. And I know that is a direction in which some on the left have gone, and best of luck to them. I won't speculate where they'll end up, but many of them will probably end up leaving politics altogether, because that's the logic of it, to become pro-imperialist at this point in time. Russian imperialism, look, if you look at the stage, global stage, the United States is the only global empire in the world. It has between 500 and 600 military bases, much stronger than it was during the Cold War. Much stronger. It has, if you look at the maps on the Department of Defense websites as to where the Americans are, they're in every continent. You compare that to Russia. It's a joke. It's a joke. I mean, the Russian bureaucracy allowed its country to be dismantled because they believed what the Americans were telling them. The conversations and the deals made between Gorbachev and the Bush administration were very clear. He said, Gorbachev said stupidly, because he should have known better, okay, we're prepared to give up East Germany, provided NATO doesn't expand eastwards. Is that a deal? And the words are very clear, NATO will not expand eastwards. That's a deal. Not expand eastwards. To be a member of the European Union now, automatically they don't like it unless you simultaneously join it. So all these deals that were done have the aim by the United States of making sure that their hegemony, global hegemony, isn't challenged. Obama's trip to Japan to set up a base in Australia, he said it very clearly, this is to tell the Chinese you watch it. So, you know, for me to compare Russia as a power to the United States is not a serious idea. It's just a joke, leave alone equating the two. I think I'm more or less covered.